In the summer of 1812, American forces attacked Canada by way of Detroit. Yeah, you heard me correctly. If you look on a map, you'll see that part of Canada actually lays south of Detroit. It's weird to say, but it's very true. And the Great Lakes region would be the initial starting point for conflict within the War of 1812. And from that standpoint, also, um, even though the United States attacked Detroit, they would get beaten back by British Canadian forces. And then eventually, also, Fort Dearborn, which is modern day Chicago, would actually get taken by Native Americans that were loyal to the British. So that was a problem. And even though on the high seas, the United States had some victories against the British, but the British would counterattack. Things weren't going too well, unless you see elsewhere in the Great Lakes region. The United States would take control and overcome various different British Allied forces, largely comprised of Native Americans, around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And in doing so, American forces would burn York, which was the capital of British Canada at the time. We know York as modern day Toronto. Yes, American forces burned down Toronto, the British Canadian capital. Okay? Hold that thought because we've got some ugly stuff coming our way. Otherwise, though, the United States does not, even though they take control of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and we have success, we burn down Toronto basically, we don't maintain any sort of occupation there. Okay? What it does, though, is weakens relations and forces of Native Americans in that area, of which Native Americans cannot recover. Okay? We decimated a lot of their allied forces there. Elsewhere, towards Florida, you have this young American military general from Tennessee, Oh Hickory, Andrew Jackson. General Jackson leads various different American forces against several different Native American tribes in the American South who were allied with the British. Again, remember, British and Canada. British Canada and Florida. Um, and he encounters the Creek tribe around modern day Alabama, chases them into Mississippi, and eventually into Spanish Baton Rouge. So, um, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson's army takes revenge on Native Americans and overcomes them very harshly. And a message is sent: do not ally with the British. We're here, we're coming, you're going to pay. And Andrew Jackson's history with Native Americans really began in the War of 1812, as this is. And he began a bitter resentment of Native Americans who sided with the British for various different reasons. And he had grown up in Tennessee, had become weary of Native Americans, especially as you had white settlers moving out west, and he developed this intense disdain for them. And it really cemented in the era of the War of 1812, specifically against the Creeks in their attempt to retreat westward. So, Andrew Jackson wins. He takes a Spanish fort at Pensacola in modern day Florida and would eventually make his way westward. Okay? So, what happens now? Remember, I said the British could reallocate forces from Europe now that Napoleon's army is being decimated. Okay, here they come. They come right up to Chesapeake. Legions of them. And guess where they target? If you thought Washington, D.C., you are correct. The large British force comes into Washington, D.C., and eventually ransacks the Capitol, and they burn down the White House. Fair play, right? I mean, we burned down the British Canadian capital at York, Toronto, right? Okay. They leave half of Washington, D.C. in ruins. Okay? Fortunately for the United States, Washington, D.C. had only been around for the better part of 10, 12 years by that point. Okay? It's not like modern day Washington, D.C. gets burned down. This is still a fledgling little community that nobody wants to be in anyway. Okay? But, point is clear. Britain burns down the American capital. But, elsewhere, in and around the Great Lakes, you would have various different engagements. But then you go back to the American South. And in the American South, along the Gulf Coast, the British don't really have success at all. They send a large force into the mouth of the Mississippi River with the intention of sacking New Orleans and driving a point home. But that guy, Andrew Jackson, by this time Major General Andrew Jackson, has a ragtag militia force, including pirates, irregular militia troops, and uniformed American U.S. soldiers. Okay? They take a little bit of a higher ground, and even though there was a larger British force that encounters New Orleans, the Americans, taking the higher ground with better protection, absolutely destroy and decimate the British forces. They kill hundreds. American casualties could almost be counted on one hand. Okay? So, New Orleans is readily defended, and Andrew Jackson would become an overnight hero. This happened in 1814. And the Battle of New Orleans actually happened after the United States and Great Britain had declared an end to fighting. You see, back in 1814, there was no such thing as Twitter. There was no email. Nobody's on Instagram or TikTok or whichever have you. If you're watching this in the future, whatever social media exists at your time, in 2020, we've got Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and Insta and, okay, all that mess. Okay. But otherwise, though, the point is clear. New Orleans makes Andrew Jackson a hero. But word still hasn't gotten around elsewhere in the United States. Remember, Washington, D.C. was ransacked by the British forces. They would leave Washington, D.C. and make their way up to Chesapeake, up towards Baltimore, with the intention of sacking Baltimore. However, American naval forces are successful in sinking some ships that would effectively block the port into Baltimore. So British naval vessels cannot make it actually into the port. So they do to Baltimore what they can. They launch various different assaults by way of cannon fire and other artillery-like mechanisms to try and wreak havoc on the port of Baltimore. And at that point of time, the British continuously tried to bombard Baltimore's port, and unfortunately, they were not successful. But there, witnessing much of the action, was Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer in Washington, who witnessed much of the firepower, the rockets, red glare, their bombs bursting in air. At the front of the port of Baltimore, there was an American flag. And the next morning, even after the onslaught of British bombardment, that flag stood there, intact, the next morning. Francis Scott Key, witnessing the onslaught of the British attack and how it had little effect, immediately wrote and put pen to paper. And he wrote a poem, and he titled it, "The Star-Spangled Banner." That is our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. That was not a result of America's war for independence, the Revolutionary War. That was written during the War of 1812. as the British tried to bombard Baltimore and were unsuccessful. That was symbolic, that was metaphoric, that the Americans can survive. We'll still be there. So in 1931, eventually, the Star-Spangled Banner was officially declared our national anthem. But the point is clear. It's the War of 1812. That also being said, what's going on with New England? New England, even though Federalists are a strong minority or a weak minority in the country at this point, it is a Federalist stronghold in New England. That's where the majority of Federalists live. Okay? They severely opposed a war with Britain, and understandably so. Britain was their largest trading power, or partner rather, in Northeast seaports. They were weakened by it. They're weakened by south and westerly expansion. So they have a stake in this war, oftentimes to the detriment of America's. So there was discussion about possible secession. Northeastern states potentially leaving and seceding from the United States. So various delegates from many of the New England states met in Hartford in 1814, and at the Hartford Convention discussed ideas for potential secession. Hardcore secessionists were outnumbered by reasonable moderates who were thinking clearly. And at this convention, it was understood now that the war is over and Andrew Jackson had defeated the British in New Orleans, and this thing is over, rendering this Hartford Convention pointless and possibly treasonous. So that ends that. And in doing so, that kind of puts the final nail on the coffin of the Federalist Party as it was known. Okay? The War of 1812, though, officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent. The United States and Britain made various different concessions. They made nice. We're going to end your demands. We're going to undo an embargo. We're going to not lay any sort of claim for Canada. And Britain is going to basically say, okay, we're not going to interfere with American commerce. We'll make nice with you. And in reality, because France was now so weak, they didn't have to be so harsh. They weren't fearful of competitors now. So now Britain is saying, okay, look, France is our real enemy. They're done. We're fine. Okay? So that would now create basically a better and a little bit more stable situation. Now, the United States and British Canada maintained various different new boundaries around that Treaty of Ghent. And basically, the boundary between the United States and Canada was extremely loose all the way until the 1870s. Okay? But otherwise, though, the result of the War of 1812 wasn't just the emergence of Andrew Jackson. It was basically another emergence of the United States having defeated a major European power yet again. And it had disastrous consequences for Native Americans. From that point forward, the inevitable would become that much more clear. Native Americans would not be able to, in large scale, defeat any sort of American military might. And in future decades, there would be more conflict. But the point is clear. Native American society is not going to be able to survive the onslaught of the coming white settlement, the westward and southern expansion thereof. That's going to be a big problem. Okay? But the War of 1812 is a little bit lesser known of a historical entity in American history. Most people don't realize that the Star-Spangled Banner was written as a result of the War of 1812. Francis Scott Key, in witnessing the British bombardment into the port of Baltimore. But it's interesting. Okay? So a lot of things about the War of 1812 and the Jeffersonian era that changed America. We expanded territorially with the Louisiana Purchase. We went to war with Britain again. America became more of a commercial power around this time, and settlement increasingly began west and west. especially with the exploration of Lewis and Clark. America's changing. And the vision that Thomas Jefferson had for the United States isn't going to quite bear out. Slowly but surely, America, while it may have agrarian roots, is going to become more and more urbanized, more commercial, and eventually more industrial. Okay? But it's a fun time to talk about in American history. And in your own time, I would encourage you to research Thomas Jefferson and just kind of see where his thoughts were. He's a unique American character and a pretty interesting founding father. Chapter 7.